Upon entering the gardener's room, the wealthy woman froze when she saw a photo. The same photo of her beloved who disappeared 20 years ago. The wealthy woman, now in her later years, had lived a life of privilege. Yet, no amount of money, luxury, or comfort had ever filled the void left by the sudden disappearance of her great love 2 decades ago. Her heart still bore the scars of his loss, the emptiness that echoed through her soul every day since he vanished. Despite the facade of her glamorous life, the pain never truly left her, lingering like a shadow. She had long ago abandoned hope of ever discovering what happened to him, resigned to her endless grief. One afternoon, while wandering her sprawling estate, her feet led her to a part of the property she rarely visited, the small quarters of her gardener. He had been in her employ for years, a man of few words who kept mostly to himself. She had never had reason to enter his space, but that day, an unusual curiosity took hold of her. As she stepped inside the modest room, she noted its simplicity: a bed, a small table, and a few personal items scattered here and there. But something on the nightstand caught her eye, a photograph, neatly framed. She approached it slowly, her heart beginning to pound in her chest. As she drew nearer, the image in the photo became clearer, and what she saw made her freeze in place. It was him, her lost love, the very man who had disappeared from her life without a trace all those years ago. His face, unchanged in the photograph, stared back at her. It was as if time had stood still, preserving his youthful features. She clutched the frame with trembling hands, her mind struggling to make sense of what she was seeing. For a long moment, she could only stare, her thoughts swirling in disbelief. How could this photograph be here, in the room of a man she barely knew? Her breath came in shallow gasps as memories of her lost love flooded back. His smile, his laughter, the way he had made her feel alive. The pain she had buried deep within her for so long resurfaced with startling intensity. She felt as though she had been transported back in time, to the day when her world had fallen apart. The room around her faded as she became consumed by her emotions. How was it possible that this man, her gardener of all people, had a photograph of the one person she had loved most? Could it be some strange coincidence? Or was there something more sinister at play? Questions buzzed in her mind, each one more troubling than the last. She felt her pulse quicken, her body gripped by a chilling uncertainty. The answers she had long sought seemed suddenly within reach, yet impossibly out of grasp. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier as she tried to process the implications of her discovery. The simplicity of the gardener's quarters was in stark contrast to the lavish surroundings of her own life. But it now held a mystery far more profound than she had ever imagined. She thought of the man who had worked for her, silently tending to her gardens for years. Could he have known her lost love? Was he connected to the disappearance in some way she had never considered? As the questions grew louder in her mind, she began to feel a creeping sense of dread. She set the photograph back down on the nightstand, unable to tear her eyes away from it. The image felt like a key, unlocking a part of her past that she had long thought closed. But with that key came fear. Fear of what she might discover. Fear that the truth might be more painful than the uncertainty she had lived with for so long. The room now felt suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. She moved to the door, her hand trembling as it gripped the handle. She wanted to confront the gardener immediately, to demand answers, but something held her back. What if she wasn't ready for what he might say? What if the truth shattered the fragile balance she had managed to build in the years since her love had disappeared? The photograph had thrown her into a whirlwind of emotions, and she wasn't sure she was prepared for the storm that would follow. As she stepped outside, the cool air hit her face, but it did nothing to calm her racing thoughts. Her heart pounded in her chest, her mind still fixated on that single image. It was impossible to ignore the gnawing suspicion that had taken root in her. The man who had worked quietly in her garden for so long suddenly seemed like a stranger, a man with secrets. She couldn't shake the feeling that the photograph was more than just a coincidence. It was a clue, a piece of a puzzle she didn't yet understand. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The answers wouldn't come easily, but she knew she had to pursue them. Ignoring the truth was no longer an option. Whatever connection the gardener had to her lost love, she would find out. Her life had been defined by the pain of that disappearance, and now, after so many years, she had a chance to uncover the truth. But as she walked back to the mansion, she couldn't help but wonder, would the answers bring her peace or more heartache? As she returned to the mansion, the photograph lingered in her thoughts, a constant, gnawing reminder of her lost love. The shock had yet to fade, replaced instead by a growing sense of dread. Her emotions were a whirlwind: grief, anger, confusion, and something else she couldn't quite name. How could such an ordinary man, her gardener, have a connection to the greatest tragedy of her life? The questions burned in her mind, but no answers seemed to present themselves. Each step she took felt heavier, weighed down by the mystery. The memories of her beloved resurfaced in vivid detail. She remembered his laughter, the warmth of his embrace, and the way his presence had made her feel invincible. And then, just as quickly as he had appeared in her life, he had vanished, leaving behind only emptiness. The days and weeks after his disappearance had been a blur of frantic searches, unanswered questions, and sleepless nights. She had scoured every corner of the world, following every lead, hoping against hope that she would find him. But all her efforts had led to nothing, until now. Now, that photo had opened old wounds, but it also reignited her hope. Was it possible that her gardener knew something? Could he have been connected to her beloved all along? The thought chilled her. It had been 20 long years, and the idea that someone so close to her, someone who had been living on her estate, might have held the key to her lover's fate was almost too much to bear. She felt an overwhelming urge to confront him immediately, to demand answers, but fear kept her rooted in place. The fear was more than just about the confrontation. It was the fear of what she might uncover. If the gardener had known something all this time, why had he kept it a secret? And what if the truth was even worse than she imagined? Her heart was torn between wanting to uncover the mystery and the terrifying possibility that the answers would bring even more pain. She had lived with this anguish for 2 decades. Did she really want to open that wound again? And yet, could she live with herself if she didn't? As she paced the halls of her grand mansion, she found herself unable to focus on anything else. The lavish surroundings that once brought her comfort now felt suffocating, as if the walls themselves were pressing in on her. Every corner of the estate seemed to whisper the same question. Why did the gardener have that photo? Her mind replayed the image of his face, frozen in time, and the memories of their time together felt closer than ever before. She was paralyzed by the weight of the unknown. Her fear began to shift into suspicion. She thought back to the gardener, his quiet demeanor, the way he had blended into the background of her life for so many years. He had always seemed so ordinary, so forgettable, and yet now she wondered if there had been more to him all along. Was it possible that he had been involved in her beloved's disappearance? Or had he known something that she didn't? Something he had chosen to keep hidden? The uncertainty gnawed at her, making it impossible to think of anything else. Part of her wanted to storm back into his quarters and demand answers. But she knew she couldn't be rash. Whatever was happening here, it required delicacy. If she confronted him too soon, she might scare him off, and the last thing she wanted was to lose her only lead. No, she would have to be patient. She would have to gather more information, even though the waiting was agony. Every moment that passed felt like a lifetime, and the tension within her grew with each unanswered question. As the hours ticked by, she found herself torn between action and hesitation. What if the gardener was dangerous? What if he was involved in something far darker than she could imagine? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. She had never imagined that the quiet man who trimmed her hedges could be anything more than just that, a simple gardener. But now, with the photograph in mind, she couldn't help but suspect there was something deeper lurking beneath the surface. The fear of what lay hidden in his past gripped her tightly. Her sleep that night was fitful, haunted by dreams of her beloved. In these dreams, she saw him standing just out of reach, his face blurry, his voice muted. She reached for him, but every time she got close, he disappeared again. leaving her with nothing but the aching sense of loss. When she awoke, her body was tense, her mind still consumed by the mystery. The photograph had opened a door to a past she had tried to forget, and now she found herself unable to close it again. The questions wouldn't let her rest. The next morning, the decision was clear. She had to know the truth. The fear was still there, but it was no longer enough to hold her back. Whatever the gardener knew, whatever his connection was to her beloved, she would find out. She couldn't live with the uncertainty any longer. It was time to confront him, to demand the answers she had been searching for all these years. But as she prepared herself for the inevitable confrontation, a deeper sense of dread settled over her. What if the truth was more than she could handle? The decision was made. She would confront the gardener, but not without first learning more about him. For so many years, he had been a quiet fixture in her life, blending into the background, never attracting attention. But now, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something important. Before she demanded answers, she needed to know more about the man who had suddenly become central to the greatest mystery of her life. So, she began to dig into his past, hoping to uncover something that might explain the photograph. Her inquiries started discreetly. She asked the staff subtle questions, careful not to raise suspicion. Everyone said the same thing. He was a quiet man, kept to himself, always reliable. No one seemed to know much about his personal life, and it struck her how easily he had managed to live in the shadows for so long. There were no friends, no family visits, no mention of where he had come from before working on her estate. The more she searched, the more he seemed to vanish into a fog of anonymity. It was as if he had been a ghost all along. Then, something unexpected surfaced. She discovered that the gardener had begun working for her shortly after her beloved had disappeared. The timing was too coincidental, and her suspicions deepened. How had she never noticed before? The pieces started to fall into place, though they formed an unsettling picture. Could it be that the gardener had known about her loss from the very beginning? Had he come into her life with a purpose she had never been aware of? The idea chilled her, but she couldn't ignore the connection. As she uncovered this new detail, her thoughts raced with possibilities. The gardener, always so quiet and reserved, suddenly seemed to hold a world of secrets behind his calm demeanor. She had once seen him as nothing more than a background figure in her life, but now he was at the center of her questions. Was he involved in her beloved's disappearance? Had he been watching her all these years, knowing more than he had ever let on? The idea was terrifying, yet it felt increasingly plausible. The more she thought about it, the more uneasy she became. She replayed every interaction she'd had with him over the years, every glance, every word. Had there been clues she had missed? Subtle hints that should have tipped her off? Her mind was a whirlwind of doubts and fears, as every memory now felt like it held hidden meaning. The man she thought she had known, the man who had worked quietly in her garden, now seemed like a stranger. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had been blind to something important all along. But it wasn't just fear that gripped her. There was also a growing sense of urgency. If the gardener had been connected to her beloved's disappearance, if he had known something all these years, then she was closer than ever to uncovering the truth. Her mind raced with the possibility that he might hold the key to everything she had spent 2 decades trying to understand. This revelation was a twist she hadn't seen coming, and it only made her more determined to get to the bottom of things. With each passing day, her need for answers grew stronger. She watched the gardener more closely now, studying his movements, his habits. Every moment he spent tending to the flowers or pruning the hedges seemed to carry a deeper significance. Did he know she was watching? Did he suspect that she was onto him? She couldn't be sure, but the tension between them was palpable. Each time they crossed paths, a strange energy filled the air, thick with the weight of unspoken truths. It became clear that she could no longer delay. The mystery of the gardener had become too large to ignore, and the photograph still haunted her. She had to know what he knew. The timing of his arrival, the presence of the photograph, and his quiet, solitary nature. Everything pointed to a secret that had been buried for far too long. The time had come to confront him, but she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever he revealed would change her life forever. The anticipation was unbearable. Every minute that passed felt like an eternity, her mind filled with 1,000 different possibilities. She rehearsed the confrontation in her mind, imagining what she would say, how he might react. But nothing could prepare her for the reality of what was to come. Deep down, she knew that the answers she sought would not bring peace, not easily, at least. The truth was rarely simple, and she feared what it might cost her. And so, she made up her mind. The next time she saw him, she would confront him with the photograph. She would demand to know how he had come to possess it and what connection he had to her beloved. The time for secrecy was over. She would get the answers she deserved, no matter the consequences. But as she steeled herself for the confrontation, a lingering dread crept into her thoughts. What if the truth was worse than the uncertainty she had lived with for so long? As she prepared to confront the gardener, the memories of her past overwhelmed her like a flood. It was impossible not to think back to those early days when her beloved had first entered her life. She had been younger then, full of life and hope, believing that nothing could ever tear them apart. The love they shared had been the kind that others only dreamed of, intense, passionate, and all-consuming. He had been everything to her, and in those moments, it had felt like their future was limitless. But when he disappeared, her world shattered. She had never been prepared for the kind of grief that followed. In the days and weeks after his vanishing, she had clung to hope, believing that he would return to her, that this was all some terrible mistake. She remembered the long nights spent waiting by the phone, the countless sleepless hours replaying their last moments together, wondering if she had missed something, some sign that might have warned her of what was to come. But the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into years, and he never returned. Even now, the pain of his loss was as sharp as ever. It had carved a permanent hole in her heart, one that no amount of wealth or distraction could ever fill. Over time, she had learned to live with the absence, to carry the weight of it without letting it break her completely. But the wounds had never truly healed. The arrival of that photograph had ripped open those old scars, forcing her to confront emotions she had buried long ago. Her life, which she had carefully rebuilt, suddenly felt fragile and uncertain again. As she thought back to their love, she remembered the joy he had brought into her life. Their days together had been filled with laughter, with dreams of a future they would build side by side. His disappearance had stolen that future from her, leaving her with only fragments of what could have been. The pain of losing him had been unbearable, but even worse was the not knowing. For years, she had lived with the torment of unanswered questions. Where had he gone, and why had he left her behind? The photograph had revived not only her grief, but also her hope. Could it be possible that he was still alive, somewhere out there? The thought both thrilled and terrified her. She had spent so long trying to move forward, to accept the reality that he was gone forever. But now, with this new mystery before her, she couldn't help but wonder. What if everything she thought she knew was wrong? What if he had been out there all along, just beyond her reach? The uncertainty gnawed at her, pulling her back into a whirlwind of emotions. She found herself battling between hope and fear. The possibility of finding him again stirred something deep within her, a spark of life that she hadn't felt in years. But with that hope came the fear of disappointment. What if the truth was darker than she imagined? What if discovering his fate brought more heartache than peace? She wasn't sure if she could survive losing him all over again. And yet, she couldn't ignore the pull of that possibility. The idea that, after all these years, there might still be a chance to find the love she had lost. Her mind wandered to the many moments they had shared, the small, intimate memories that had once seemed insignificant, but now felt precious beyond measure. She thought of the way he used to look at her, as though she were the only person in the world. She thought of their secret plans, the whispers of promises made late at night, when the rest of the world was asleep. Those memories, once a source of comfort, now felt like a cruel reminder of all that had been stolen from her. The pain of the past weighed heavily on her, but there was also a flicker of strength within her. She had survived 20 years without him. She had endured the heartbreak, the unanswered questions, and the endless search for closure. Now, as she stood on the brink of discovering the truth, She knew that she had to see it through, no matter the cost. The photograph had changed everything, and though it had reopened old wounds, it had also given her a purpose she hadn't felt in a long time. She could no longer avoid the confrontation that was coming. The gardener held the answers she had been seeking for so long, and the time for silence had passed. Yet, even as she prepared herself for that moment, she couldn't help but wonder if she was truly ready to face what lay ahead. Her emotions were raw, and the pain of the past clung to her like a shadow. But there was no turning back now. The past had come rushing back into her life, and she would have to confront it once and for all. The confrontation would come soon enough, but for now, she allowed herself to linger in the memories of her love. It was a bittersweet comfort to remember the man who had once been her entire world. She wasn't sure what the future held, or if the answers would bring her the peace she so desperately craved. But one thing was certain: the pain of the past had shaped her into who she was, and it would also guide her through whatever was to come next. The moment had come. She had spent days mulling over her next steps, gathering her courage for what was to come. The gardener, once a silent figure in the background of her life, was now the key to unlocking the mystery that had haunted her for so long. With the photograph still fresh in her mind, she couldn't delay any longer. She had to confront him. She had to know the truth, no matter what it revealed. Her heart pounded as she walked across the estate, each step heavier than the last. She found him in the garden, tending to the roses. The peaceful scene was a stark contrast to the turmoil inside her. She stood there for a moment, watching him, trying to reconcile the quiet, unassuming man before her with the possibility that he held the answers to her greatest sorrow. Taking a deep breath, she approached, her voice trembling slightly as she called out his name. He looked up, his expression as neutral as ever, but she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a hesitation, a knowing. Without preamble, she pulled the photograph from her pocket and held it up for him to see. "How do you have this?" Her voice was sharper than she intended, cutting through the calm of the garden. For a brief moment, the gardener said nothing, his eyes fixed on the photo, his expression unreadable. She could see the tension in his body, the way his hands stilled, as if he were weighing his options. The silence stretched between them, thick and oppressive, until finally, he spoke. "I knew him," the gardener said, his voice low and steady. The admission hit her like a physical blow, and she struggled to keep her composure. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed sent her mind spinning. She pressed him for more, her voice rising with urgency. How? How did you know him? What happened to him?" The questions tumbled out in a rush, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She had waited 20 years for this moment, and now that it was here, she felt unsteady, as if the ground beneath her was shifting. The gardener's face remained calm, but there was a heaviness in his eyes that she hadn't noticed before. He hesitated again, as if searching for the right words. He didn't disappear by accident," he finally said, his voice strained. "There were things happening back then, things you didn't know about." Her heart raced as she listened, the weight of his words settling in. She had imagined 1,000 different scenarios over the years, but nothing could have prepared her for this. The man she loved hadn't just vanished. There had been a reason, a purpose behind his disappearance. "What things?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "What aren't you telling me?" The frustration and fear in her voice were palpable, and for a moment, the gardener looked away, unable to meet her gaze. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, filled with an old pain that mirrored her own. There were people after him, dangerous people. He got caught up in something he couldn't escape. The revelation hung in the air between them, and for a moment, all she could do was stare at him, her mind struggling to process the enormity of what he was saying. Her mind reeled with the possibilities. Had her beloved been involved in something criminal? Or had he been a victim, pulled into a web of danger against his will? The questions burned in her, but the answers still felt elusive. She pressed him again, her voice more desperate now. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you say anything all these years?" The betrayal in her tone was unmistakable. The gardener had been a silent witness to her suffering for 2 decades, And yet, he had said nothing. She couldn't understand how he had kept this secret for so long. The gardener's face hardened slightly, his own pain surfacing. "Because I didn't know everything. And I promised him I wouldn't tell you until it was safe." His words were quiet but firm, and they struck her with the force of their truth. He had been protecting her, in his own way. But still, the sense of betrayal lingered. How could he have kept this from her? How could he have stood by, watching her grieve, knowing that there was more to the story? The emotions swirled inside her: anger, confusion, and a deep, aching sadness. She wanted to lash out, to demand more answers, but something in his expression stopped her. The gardener had been living with his own burden, carrying the weight of a secret that wasn't his to reveal. And now, in this moment, she saw that he was as much a prisoner of the past as she was. The anger that had fueled her confrontation began to fade, replaced by a heavy sadness. She still didn't have all the answers, but she realized that the man standing before her was not her enemy. He had been caught in the same web of mystery and pain. As the confrontation drew to a close, she felt exhausted, both emotionally and physically. The truth was beginning to emerge, but it was more complicated than she had imagined. The gardener had known her beloved, and he had known more about his disappearance than he had ever let on. But there were still pieces missing, details that remained hidden in the shadows. She wasn't sure what to believe anymore, but one thing was clear: the gardener wasn't the villain she had imagined. He had been trying to protect her all along, even if his silence had caused her pain. The answers she sought were still out of reach, but she knew now that she couldn't turn back. The truth was coming, piece by piece, and though it terrified her, she had to see it through. As she looked into the gardener's weary eyes, she felt the weight of their shared burden. They were both tied to the past, bound by secrets and loss. And now, for the first time, they would face the future together, no longer enemies, but unlikely allies in the search for the truth. The weight of the gardener's confession hung heavily in the air, thick with tension and unspoken pain. She felt her world shifting beneath her as his words sank in. Her beloved hadn't just disappeared. He had been forced into hiding, trapped in a dangerous web of circumstances that had stolen him away from her. As the gardener stood before her, visibly burdened by the truth he had carried for years, she could feel that something even darker was about to surface. She wasn't prepared, but the truth was finally coming to light. The gardener took a deep breath, as though the weight of his next words would be too much to bear. "It wasn't an accident," he began, his voice low, almost trembling. "He got involved with people he shouldn't have. Business dealings, things he thought he could handle. But it spiraled out of control. When he realized the danger, it was too late." Her heart pounded in her chest as she listened, every sentence unraveling the life she thought she knew. The man she had loved had been caught in something far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The revelation hit her like a storm. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. "Dangerous?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What kind of danger?" The gardener hesitated, and for a moment, she saw the conflict in his eyes. He had guarded these secrets for so long, protecting her from a truth that was too brutal to face. But now, there was no turning back. He owed them money, people with power, people who don't forgive easily. They were going to come after him, and when he realized he couldn't escape, he made the decision to disappear. Her beloved hadn't just left her. He had been forced to flee, to vanish from the world they had built together. The weight of this realization crushed her, leaving her breathless. The man she had mourned for so long hadn't abandoned her out of choice. He had been running for his life, caught between the love they shared and the threats that loomed over him. She could hardly believe that she had been living in ignorance all these years, while he had been fighting to survive in the shadows. But the gardener wasn't finished. His face grew even graver, and she braced herself for the next wave of truth. "I was there," he confessed. "I didn't know how deep he was in until it was too late. I was just supposed to be an observer, someone keeping an eye on the situation. But when things went wrong, I got pulled in. I couldn't stop what happened, but I could make sure you were safe. That's why I stayed." His words left her reeling. The gardener, the quiet man who had been a constant presence in her life, had been involved from the very beginning. Her knees felt weak as the magnitude of his confession hit her. The gardener had been more than just a bystander. He had been a witness to her beloved's downfall, caught up in the storm of events that had led to his disappearance. And yet, he had chosen to stay, to watch over her in silence, carrying the weight of his guilt and secrets. She looked at him now with new eyes, seeing the depth of his sacrifice, the quiet loyalty that had driven him to protect her for all these years. The realization was overwhelming. The truth was more than she could have ever anticipated. Her beloved had not left her out of cruelty or indifference. He had been protecting her, just as the gardener had. But with that protection came a terrible cost: 20 years of pain, loneliness, and unanswered questions. The love of her life had been hiding from the world, but in doing so, he had also hidden from her, leaving her to grieve for a man who was still out there, somewhere. Tears welled up in her eyes as she tried to process it all. "Why didn't he tell me?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why didn't he trust me?" The gardener looked down, his face lined with regret. "He didn't want to drag you into his mess. He thought you'd be safer if you believed he was gone. He wanted you to move on, to live without the danger he was caught in. He never stopped loving you, but he thought staying would only hurt you more." The words were both comforting and devastating, offering her a glimpse of the love he had held onto, even in his absence. The truth was finally out, but it didn't bring the relief she had hoped for. Instead, it left her feeling raw, as if the wound that had festered for years had finally been reopened. She understood now why he had left, why he had felt he had no choice. But understanding didn't make the pain any easier to bear. She had spent 2 decades mourning him, only to learn that he had been alive, hiding, all along. The betrayal and the love mingled together, creating a storm of emotions she couldn't untangle. The gardener stood in silence, watching her as she struggled to absorb it all. He had been a silent guardian, living with his own guilt for years, knowing that one day, the truth would come out. And now that it had, there was nothing more to hide. He had fulfilled the promise he had made to her beloved, to protect her from the darkness of the past. But the truth, once revealed, was a heavy burden to bear for them both. As she stood there, the weight of the past pressing down on her, she knew her journey wasn't over. The truth had been revealed, but there were still pieces missing, still questions unanswered. What had become of her beloved? Was he still alive, still hiding in the shadows? The gardener had given her the answers she had sought for so long. But now, there was a new mystery to solve. She couldn't rest until she found him, until she knew what had become of the man she had loved. Now that the truth had been revealed, a new determination took hold of her. The pain of the past still weighed heavily on her, but with it came a burning desire to uncover the full story. Her beloved had disappeared to protect her, but where was he now? Was he still alive? Or had the danger finally caught up with him? The gardener had given her the first pieces of the puzzle, but she knew the journey wasn't over. She needed more. She needed to find him, to know his fate. With a newfound resolve, she turned to the gardener, the only person who could help her. They sat together, for the first time as allies rather than strangers, and began to plan their search. The gardener, who had lived in the shadows of her life for so long, now stepped into the light as a partner in her quest. He explained that her beloved had cut all ties to protect her, disappearing into a world that was nearly impossible to trace. But there were clues. There were people who had once known him, people who might still have answers. Together, they would find them. Their first step was to revisit the past. The gardener suggested that they start with old acquaintances, those who had been involved in her beloved's life before the danger had struck. She knew it wouldn't be easy. Most of those people had disappeared as well, scattered across the globe. Some might not even want to be found. But she couldn't stop now. Each person they tracked down could hold a piece of the story, a lead that would bring her closer to the truth. As they delved deeper, revisiting old memories and retracing her beloved's steps, the bond between her and the gardener grew stronger. What had started as suspicion and mistrust evolved into something more profound. They shared the same grief, the same need for answers, and that connection bound them together in ways she hadn't anticipated. He had been her silent protector for so long, and now, As they faced the unknown together, she realized how much he had sacrificed for her. Their journey took them across cities and towns, from old acquaintances to forgotten haunts, as they pieced together the fragments of her beloved's life after his disappearance. The search was exhausting, both emotionally and physically, but with each lead, they grew closer. Along the way, they encountered those who remembered him fondly, as well as those who wished to forget. Some doors opened willingly, while others were slammed shut in their faces. But she refused to give up, driven by the hope that she might still find him. As the weeks passed, their progress was slow but steady. The gardener proved invaluable, using his own connections and knowledge of the hidden world her beloved had once inhabited. Together, they uncovered old records, hidden correspondence, and whispered rumors. Every discovery was another step forward, but with each answer came more questions. Had her beloved managed to escape the danger, or had he fallen deeper into it? The uncertainty gnawed at her, but she pressed on, unwilling to let fear stop her. Through it all, her emotions were in constant turmoil. There were moments of hope, when a new clue seemed to bring her closer to him, followed by crushing disappointment when the trail went cold. She often wondered if she was chasing a ghost, if her beloved had been lost to her forever. But the gardener remained steadfast, urging her to keep going, reminding her that the truth was within reach. His quiet strength gave her the courage to continue, even when her own resolve faltered. The search became more than just a quest for answers. It became a journey of healing. With each step, she confronted not only the mystery of her beloved's disappearance, but also the pain she had carried for so long. The wounds that had festered for years began to heal, not because the truth was easy to find, but because she was finally facing it. The gardener, who had once seemed so distant, became her companion in this healing process, sharing in her grief and offering his support. As they neared the end of their search, she found herself reflecting on the journey they had taken together. The person she had been at the start, broken, lost, and consumed by grief, was no longer who she was now. She had grown stronger, more resilient, and though the pain of the past still lingered, it no longer controlled her. She had learned to live with it, to accept that the answers she sought might not bring closure, but they would bring truth. Finally, they reached the final piece of the puzzle, an old friend of her beloved's who had been living off the grid for years. It was a risky meeting, but she knew it was the key to everything. As they prepared for the encounter, she couldn't shake the feeling that this would be the moment that changed everything. The search for answers had led her here, to this final step. Whether she found her beloved or the confirmation of his fate, she was ready to face whatever came next. As they approached the remote cabin where her beloved's old friend was said to live, her heart raced with anticipation. The search that had consumed her for weeks, possibly even years, was finally reaching its conclusion. She wasn't sure what she would find beyond that door. Whether it would be her beloved, alive and waiting, or merely the answers to his fate. But one thing was certain. The journey had already changed her in ways she couldn't have predicted. Love, loss, and the possibility of forgiveness now wove together in her heart, forming something new and resilient. When the door finally opened, it wasn't her beloved who greeted her, but a man weathered by time and secrets. He knew immediately why she had come. His eyes carried the weight of too many years of silence. As they sat down to talk, she felt the final pieces of the puzzle begin to click into place. He revealed that her beloved had indeed been alive for many years after his disappearance, living in hiding, far from the reach of those who had once threatened him. But the years had taken their toll. Her beloved had passed away quietly, only a few years ago, still thinking of her every day. The news hit her with a mixture of grief and relief. He was gone, yes, but she finally had closure. He hadn't abandoned her. He had protected her in the only way he knew how. As the weight of this truth settled over her, she realized that forgiveness, both for herself and for him, was what she needed most. She had spent so many years feeling betrayed, believing he had chosen to leave her, when in reality, his love had driven him to make the hardest choice of all. He had sacrificed their future to ensure her safety. In that moment, she felt a sense of peace wash over her, something she hadn't felt in years. Her heart, though still heavy with sorrow, was no longer bound by the bitterness and confusion that had held it captive for so long. She could finally forgive him for disappearing, for keeping her in the dark, because she understood now. His love had never wavered, even in the darkest of times. And in forgiving him, she also began to forgive herself for holding on to the pain, for not trusting in his love enough to believe there was more to the story. The gardener stood by her side throughout it all, a quiet, steadfast presence. He had been with her through every twist and turn of this journey, and now, as it came to an end, she looked at him with new eyes. He, too, had sacrificed much. His own life had been shaped by the promise he made to her beloved. He had carried the burden of secrecy and guilt for 2 decades, watching her suffer, all while knowing the truth. And yet, he had remained by her side, protecting her in his own way, even when she didn't realize it. In the quiet moments after the truth was revealed, she turned to the gardener, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Their shared pain had forged a bond between them that went deeper than she had ever expected. Theirs was a connection born of loss, but also of love. Love for the man they both cherished, and a love that had transformed them both in ways they couldn't have foreseen. In his own way, the gardener had shown her the power of love, not in grand gestures, but in the quiet acts of loyalty and care that had sustained her all these years. As they left the cabin, walking side by side, she knew that the past would no longer hold her captive. The man she had loved was gone, but his memory would live on, not as a source of pain, but as a reminder of the depth of their connection. The journey had been long, and at times unbearable, but it had brought her to a place of peace she hadn't thought possible. She had found not only the answers she sought, but also a deeper understanding of herself, of love, and of forgiveness. In the weeks that followed, she allowed herself to grieve anew. But this time, the grief was different. It wasn't the hollow ache of unresolved loss, but a quieter, more peaceful sorrow. She could remember her beloved with fondness now, without the sharp sting of betrayal. And as she healed, she also grew closer to the gardener. Their shared journey had opened the door to something new, a friendship, perhaps more, grounded in trust and mutual respect. They had both carried the weight of the past for so long, and now they were free to move forward, together. In the end, she realized that love had taken many forms in her life. The love she had shared with her beloved was eternal, but so too was the love that had grown from the unexpected places, like her bond with the gardener. Life, she understood now, was not about the perfect love story, but about the ways we learn to carry love with us, even after loss. She had learned to forgive, not only for the choices made in the past, but for the pain they had caused. And in that forgiveness, she found the freedom to love again, in whatever form that love might take. As she stood once more in the garden, looking at the roses her gardener had so carefully tended over the years, she felt a quiet sense of hope bloom within her. Love had brought her to this point, and it would guide her forward. The journey was over, but in many ways it had just begun. Before you go, don't miss the next story that's about to appear on your screen. It's filled with unexpected twists, emotional turns, and a mystery that will keep you on the edge of your seat. You won't want to miss what happens next. It's even more intense and gripping than what you've just seen. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you can keep getting the best, most emotional stories delivered right to you. Don't forget to leave a comment and share what you thought of this journey. Your thoughts mean a lot,